Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you around the globe who are attending today's webinar. Welcome. We're really delighted you're here. We hope that you, your families, colleagues, and communities are as safe as possible during this very difficult time. We are really honored that you have chosen to take time away from your very busy lives to spend the next hour and a half with us, whether or not you're in your living room, home office, or maybe even a closet hiding from your kids. We're very happy that you could attend, and we wish all of you well. The World Commission on Environmental Law, or WCEL, is one of the 6 expert volunteer commissions of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN. And we are delighted to start this new WCEL webinar series with the first session entitled Using Environmental Law Tools to Address Global Pandemics. The topic, I'm sure you will agree, could not be more timely or more urgent. And we are delighted that we have 270 people attending today's webinar, which is amazing and an indication of how interested we all are in this topic. My name is Denise Antolini. I'm the Deputy Chair of the World Commission on Environmental Law and a Professor of Law at the University of Hawaii, William S. Richardson School of Law. And I'm here at my home on the North Shore of Oahu in Hawaii. And you may hear a rooster or a lawnmower, but we're all in the midst of our transitions in our lives. And it's actually quite nice to share this personal part of us across the world. It is indeed amazing how connected we all are now, and we hope that this webinar series keeps us better connected. I'm honored to be your moderator today. We have a very distinguished panel of experts whom you're going to meet and hear from in just a minute. I have a little information to share with you about the World Commission on Environmental Law and then some housekeeping, and then we'll get started. So the WCEL is a volunteer network of environmental and law and policy experts from all regions of the world who volunteer their knowledge and services to the IUCN, its partners, and the general public, and the legal community around the world. We now have over 1,200 members, many of whom are attending today's webinar. And we provide a lot of resources. And you can find those on our website. And if all attendees might open your chat box, if you're not familiar, your chat box is at the bottom of the screen. And occasionally we may send messages out to all of the attendees of this webinar. So in the chat box now, you'll see both the website for WCEL, which has a lot of interesting updated news and articles, and also the specific page for this webinar where you can keep in touch about future webinars as well. Many of you know WCEL had to postpone the Second World Environmental Law Congress with our wonderful partners. It was planned for Rio de Janeiro just a few weeks ago. It would have run from the 23rd to the 27th of March. And unfortunately, due to the looming pandemic, like many other organizations around the world, we had to take a very close look at the science and health advice and postpone our Congress. So it is now scheduled for the 28th September through 2 October. And we all hope that the world is in better shape by then. Those of you who are involved with IUCN should also know that the World Conservation Congress has also been postponed in Marseille until January 2021. So in the meantime, we have a lot to do. We have a lot to think about, and we have opportunities to see nature rebound, but we also have a lot of challenges to think about how to achieve a resilient future. So out of our disappointment about postponing the Congress came this very good idea to create a webinar series so that we can all stay connected, we can engage with the membership, we can share our expertise and learn from everyone. And we really need to press forward during this period to help strengthen environmental law and policy. It's even more urgent now. So you're going to hear in a minute from our panelists how we're going to do that. Okay, just a minute on some housekeeping matters. So you have already opened your chat box at the bottom. That allows the panelists and the hosts to send messages to the attendees. I would also ask all attendees now to open the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. It's a little question and answer box. Again, some of you are very familiar with this. If you're not, when you open that up, that allows all attendees to type in questions for the panelists. So I would ask that you keep your questions fairly short because we have a lot of participants with, sure, a lot of questions. When you type your question, we may be able to answer it right away, or we may answer it during the Q&A period at the end. So now I want to thank two people who are invisible, who are co-hosts today, who will be watching the questions come in and helping manage the answers, so you may get replies from them. First, Dr. Claudia DeVent, an environmental law expert specializing in Latin American issues, who spent many years with the Organization of American States. She's on the steering committee of WCEL. And Emily Gaskin, an environmental lawyer, who is the executive officer of the commission. So again, as an attendee, you won't see the other questions, but when we answer them live, you'll be able to see them and hear the answer. A little bit more housekeeping. We are recording this webinar. We hope to post it fairly quickly and to share it as broadly as possible. So in the interest of time, we're also going to be timing all the panelists and trying to keep the whole thing to 90 minutes. Last, I must add that the views expressed today just represent the views of the individual speakers and are not necessarily the position of the commission, nor the position of the IUCN as a whole. This is a purely educational webinar, and we hope inspirational as well. Now let me briefly introduce our panelists. You will find their biographies in the webinar page, which is now in your chat box. So I'm not going to go into the details. I'm simply going to give their title and ask them to just say hello to you from their respective offices or living rooms. And we've slightly changed the order, so I'm going to start first with Dr. Chris Walzer, who is the Executive Director of Wildlife Health for the Wildlife Conservation Society. He'll be speaking on spillovers, rethinking our relationship with wildlife and wild places. So say hello, Chris.
Yeah, good afternoon from the Bronx. Did you not hear me?
Did that come through? Okay, did it? Okay. Second, did it come through? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, great. Thanks. For some reason, I couldn't hear you, Chris. All right. Second, Professor Nicholas Robinson, Emeritus Chair of WCEL, Professor of Law at the Elizabeth Hobbs School of Law at Pace University. He will be speaking on ecological legal pathways to avert the next pandemic. Say hello to everyone, Nick.
Well, great to see you all in virtual reality. Hope you're all well.
Thank you. And third, Elizabeth Marema, Acting Executive Secretary for the Secretariat on the Convention on Biological Diversity. Elizabeth is also a longtime member of the WCEL Steering Committee, and she'll be speaking on reducing biodiversity loss at the crossroads of human, ecosystems, and animal health.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, different parts of the world. It's a pleasure to be here virtually.
Thank you to the panelists. So after Elizabeth concludes, I will transition us to Q&A, and we really look forward to everyone's remarks. So with that, we will get started with Chris. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much. I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know if there's any problem listening or hearing me speak. Let's see how this works. Yeah, I think you should see the screen right now, and I'll just move on. So thanks very much for having me. I hope everyone is well out there in the world. It's always fascinating to sit here and imagine people all over the world listening in. So it's great to have you. I'm sure each and every one of you has been following the outbreak, and you've probably all read every single book about pandemics and epidemics and all the rest of it. So everyone nowadays is actually already halfway to being an epidemiologist, which is amazing. We discuss things at a completely different level than just 4 months ago. But I want to take you through some of the basics as an introduction and background. So I'm going to sort of structure it into what do we know, what do we not know, and what can we do to get that information. So basically, as a very basic zoonosis, and this is a zoonotic virus, are diseases that move, or disease agents that move between animals and humans. And it goes both ways. But in this case, and most obviously more impact to us, is when it moves from animals to humans. Emerging infectious diseases on a global scale are dominated by zoonosis. And about 72% of all zoonotic emerging infectious disease originate in wildlife. So it's a really important role of wildlife. And some of them that you know, for example, HIV, Ebola, the influenza viruses, then obviously SARS, Nipah, and Hendra viruses. These are just some of the zoonotic diseases that infectious diseases you've certainly already heard from in the last few months. What's really important to understand as well is that emerging infectious diseases are increasing in the past decades. And also to understand that it's not a really rare event. So we've acquired a lot of diseases over the years, over the thousands of years as we domesticated livestock, for example. And one of the most known diseases, measles, which we've acquired from cattle, probably during the domestication process. And we've made that our own disease now. You cannot infect cattle anymore with measles. So we've made it our uniquely own disease. So heading on to COVID-19 or the SARS coronavirus 2, what do we know? And I'm just going to do this very shortly, just to provide the background. Sometime in the mid-November, probably, the first cases were noted in China, in around the city of Wuhan. This was a pneumonia that was somewhat atypical and raised concerns. By the end of December, the Chinese authorities notified the WHO that they had a cluster of pneumonia and of infectious origin, but at the time still unknown. But very rapidly, and this is quite a huge contrast to the SARS outbreak in 2002 and 2003, it was actually identified as a coronavirus, and the sequence of the virus was made available by mid-January, which is really extraordinary. And then the cases increased, and what was important was that a large part, about 50% of the initial cases were associated with the wildlife market. So this is a market that trades wildlife and is often referred to in its entirety as a wet market. But it's really important to highlight right off the beginning here that it's not about wet markets. Wet markets are markets that sell everything from fish to produce to, and a very vital part of the for providing access to food, high quality food. But the point is, in these in these wet markets, there is also a wildlife trading component. And these wildlife trading components in Southeast Asia and China are extraordinary. They're on orders of magnitude larger and more diverse than anything else on the planet. It is, on the one side, the animals are alive. That is quite unique. So the animals are sold alive, which gives them the opportunity to shed viruses for days often and share these viruses with other animals which they're housed on top of or next to. So you will have these animals stacked on top of each other, sometimes 50 to 100 different species of wildlife housed together with domestic animals, mostly pigs and poultry. And all of them, or most of them, are alive and shed. Then these markets will also process the wildlife. That means they are slaughtered on site. So you will have blood and organs being exposed. So what is unclear, unfortunately, is how the virus actually entered the human transmission chain. And one of the reasons is the market was identified as being associated with this outbreak. And so it was cleared very, very quickly, and no animals, it seems, were sampled to determine for the source of the virus. But what's important to remember, and that sort of got lost a little bit, is there were 500 environmental samples taken at the time. And of these 500 and some samples, 33 of them were positive. And of these 33 samples, 31 originated from the western part of the market where the wildlife was housed. So that was after clearing. There was still this very, very strong signal from the western part of the market and the wildlife section. So moving forwards, one of the other things that we know, because we had the sequence was provided very quickly, and that, you know, there are obviously hundreds and hundreds of sequences out there now, that the ancestral or evolutionary host of this SARS coronavirus 2 was to be found in a horseshoe bat. The horseshoe bats are a group of bats which are widely distributed throughout Southeast Asia and China, and they have been identified as carrying numerous, hundreds of coronaviruses in the past. So, well, that's one thing we knew very, very quickly by the by mid-January already. The alignment showed us that there's 96% full genome alignment with a coronavirus from a horseshoe bat. Let me just put that in perspective, though. First of all, it is completely natural and normal for wildlife and similar to us to house viruses and other pathogens which do not cause any kind of disease. We're just reservoir, we harbor them, and they do not cause disease unless, sometimes these viruses manage to switch hosts where they then can cause disease. So just to put it in perspective, there's about 1.7 million unknown viruses. It's estimated 1.7 million unknown viruses in birds and mammals alone. And of those 1.7 million unknown viruses, about 700,000 are assumed to have properties that they could potentially infect humans. So that's a lot of viruses, and that also sort of defeats this idea of that we're going to develop a vaccine which is going to protect us from these viruses. As an example, for every coronavirus that has been described, there are thousands of them unknown circulating in wildlife. So that's really important to understand. So one of the things that we don't know. So one of the things we don't know, if you look at this graph here, we'll see, we know that bats are involved as ancestral hosts. And this bat here in the middle is the bat for the SARS virus from the 2002-2003 outbreak. What we do know that this original SARS coronavirus ancestral host was in a bat, and it spilled over to humans using amplification in an intermediary host in a civet cat and raccoon dogs. And a similar coronavirus, also from bats in the Middle East, uses the domesticated dromedary camel to bring about MERS, a similar respiratory disease also in humans. But what we don't know is how the virus from the bat entered the humans. And this is obviously something been widely speculated in what's termed as the infodemic. Lots of information out there, a lot of it not founded on good science. It varies from snakes. That was one of the earliest ones, which is completely ludicrous, to coronavirus from space, which seems even more ludicrous, obviously. And then the poor pangolins have been touted quite a lot as an intermediary host, but at the moment it's really important to understand it's really not about bat soup, civets, or pangolins, but it's all about interfaces. And these interfaces are the contact areas between humans and wildlife and intact places and wild places. Generally, as a general comment, these interfaces are increasing massively across the globe. There are interfaces all over, there are different types of interfaces. And just today, I want to stress the interface created by wildlife trading markets in Southeast Asia are exceptional due to their diversity of species that come from a global, from many regions across the globe. They bring together species which are alive, as I pointed out, from areas where they would never normally meet, and they expose them to thousands and thousands of humans at the same time because you have the vendors and the customers. So that's an exceptional interface. And that's why a lot of the initial messaging and a lot of the discussion around it has been focused on these markets. But let us not forget in these times that there are many other interfaces. This is a classic interface. For some people, this would be a road that goes from A to B. If you're looking at it from a disease perspective, this is a really long interface. right and left of this road, you have what are the frontiers of destruction, basically. This is the part where the forest is being encroached on. This is where people are moving in and out of the forest. And remember, in the past, that was a remote location somewhere in Africa or the Amazon. Nowadays, that road is a mere 12 to 24 hours away from any European city. It's you'll catch your rat and you'll take it to the road, you'll sell it to a truck driver, and he will move that into a city pretty quickly. So I also want to point out one of the things seen on the right. There's a sort of a graphic. This is from my colleague Raina Plowright, and she points out all the factors and all the barriers that are needed, that a virus needs to overcome to actually enter humans. So it is a really rare occurrence. It doesn't happen all the time because there are multiple barriers. The virus needs to mutate to switch the species. It needs to enter the human cell. From there, it needs to be able to reproduce and then develop the capacity to actually transmit from human to human. And that's thankfully very, very rare. One of the things we need to do, we also need to be very clear about the difference in the use of wild meat. One of the things is that when you talking about wild meat in large urban centers in Southeast Asia, we're talking about the new middle class that have capacity to buy these expensive products. There is no nutritional need. It's not to cover their protein needs at all. But on the other hand, in many parts of the world, especially in Central Africa and some areas of South America, indigenous peoples and local communities are absolutely dependent on wild meat as their only source of protein. So we need to make sure that we have a more nuanced message when we try to ban trade and the use of wildlife. And we need to absolutely guarantee the access of these local communities and indigenous peoples to the to protein from wild meat. That being said, we also need to combine this with monitoring techniques. This is a wildlife monitoring of carcasses out in northern Congo. The modern technologies that we have available nowadays allow us to take PCR in the field. We can test a carcass within 45 minutes if it is positive for Ebola virus, for example. So pairing traditional knowledge with modern technologies at the front lines is really one way forwards. And then summarizing this all together, and I am sure Nick is going to talk a lot more about this as well, but one of the things that we really need to be aware of, we need a very holistic approach to health. We cannot silo out animal health, wildlife health from human health and ecosystem health. And one of the frameworks that have been proposed for this are the 2019 Berlin Principles of One Health, which have been a long-term commitment from the Wildlife Conservation Society towards this concept, and we're working hard at trying to get that implemented across the board. So I just want to end with this one final slide. What are the things we need to do in this acute phase beyond support our frontline medical staff, of course, but we do need to ban the commercial trade of wildlife for consumption, especially in urban areas and especially in these animals and these markets that trade in live animals. We also need to strengthen at the same time the efforts to combat trafficking, as there's going to be a slight shift to illegal trade in wildlife, obviously. And we need to work on education to change the consumption behaviors, while we also mainstream a sort of holistic One Health approaches across agencies and multilaterals. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Chris. That was a remarkable perspective that was timely, engaging, and a little bit scary and urgent, but that's what we need. So thank you so much. I would encourage panelists, attendees who have questions for Chris, go ahead and type them in now, because he will get a chance to answer them later. But we've already had many wonderful questions coming your direction, Chris, so thank you so much. You also very beautifully set up the next speaker, Professor Nick Robinson. So I'm just going to hand it right over to Nick. Go ahead, Nick.
Well, thank you very much, Denise, and that was a great presentation from Chris, which sets up the One Health paradigm. And I'm going to talk about the environmental laws that are available for us to advance that model. I'll put on my screen share and put up the slideshow, which now should appear. It's been wonderful to have the Commission launch this webinar series, and I think it's a privilege for the three of us to be the first speakers for the Commission. Now, I'm going to talk about the legal tools. I've been working on this with the International Council of Environmental Law, which you in the Commission will remember was founded by Wolfgang Borchene back 50 years ago. It's been reconstituted and works now from Spain. And I've been working with Chris trying to build more understanding among different professionals about the One Health approach. We published this little piece in Scientific American, which I think is available on the Commission's website. But the fundamental point is that human, animal, plant, and environmental health and well-being are all intrinsically connected and profoundly influenced by human behavior. And this is the One Health approach. It's something that the environmental law community has known for a long time. We've been trying to build a holistic approach that integrates across sectors through such techniques as environmental impact assessment procedures. And it was very exciting when in October of 2019, the German Foreign Office and the Wildlife Conservation Society advanced again the importance of the One Health paradigm, basically to retain the essential health links between humans, wildlife, domesticated animals, and plants, and indeed all of nature. This, of course, is a message that we put into the World Charter for Nature when it was adopted. The Commission worked very hard on the drafting of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and it's really at the core of what the CBD is trying to build internationally. So we know zoonosis. The trouble is zoonosis has been known to epidemiologists, veterinarians, wildlife conservation leaders, but it has not been well understood by the broad policy-making arena of government. The World Health Organization, after SARS, has put out a watch for the next big virus that would spill over and cause an epidemic the way Ebola did. They call it the watch for virus X last February in 2018. Among all the books that Chris put up, David Quammen's book was a bestseller on the New York Times book review, Spillover, the Animal Infections and the Next Human Pandemic in 2012. Epidemiologists have been very worried about this, and Dr. Ian Lipkin at Columbia helped inspire the movie Contagion, but even a popular film widely seen by people didn't stir our concern very much. And I'm sad to say that when the Manhattan Principles came out, after the first SARS, I thought, I was at the conference at Rockefeller University, I thought, well, we're finally gonna get somewhere, but it didn't catch on either. So why did we fail to heed all of these? Well, there are lots of views as to why humans discount risk, but we're in the risk now, we're in the middle of it. There are at least 5 reasons why we've not properly followed the warnings that the epidemiologists have given us. One is, I think, that the political awareness of environmental science, here it is, 50 years after Earth Day, is very primitive. Ecology was founded only in the beginning of the 1900s. Most of the ecologists were killed off during the First World War and the first influenza pandemic in 1918. And it was only when the Atomic Energy Commission decided to fund a lot of ecological studies for the safe atom that after the World War II, ecology was restored as a major and growing science with many ecologists. Virology also is a relatively new science. The American Association on Virology is only dates from the early 1980s. But more importantly, in the outside world, beyond the scientific world, human populations have, massively grown. And so the capacity, as we've increased the world's population of humans, to interrupt animals and their habitat and dislodge the viruses into our bodies has grown significantly. And as Chris points out, it took a long time for a sailing ship to carry the bubonic plague around, but airplanes do it in less than a day. And so it's not surprising that governments haven't come up with an understanding of all of this. And so we have a health department that works on once we're sick, but doesn't work on ambient prevention. But we put environmental agencies in charge of working on pollution, which could make us sick, as with asthma, but it doesn't really address zoonosis. And we don't fund the wildlife conservation agencies or treat them in the same way. So we've got to be ready. And there are important links that have been put together. We had plenty of warning that this was coming. We had a lot of preparation for it. And we even have agreement on what we should do about the disruption of nature. So we have Sustainable Development Goal number 15, which sets the global priority for protecting, restoring, and promoting the sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, especially in forests, and halting and reversing land degradation and biodiversity loss. And if we read back into Goal 15, zoonosis, and we want to treat the health and sustainability of the terrestrial environment realistically, we have to read back into these agreements on a priority basis, the health of the natural environment. We have the legal tools to do this, just as we have with SDG 15 as a policy instrument. Last March, again, it's too late to have had an impact. The FAO, the World Health Organization, and the International Organization for Animal Health published a tripartite guide to address diseases in countries, policies that could be used to avert this kind of pandemic. And then the very excellent initiative of the Wildlife Conservation Society and the German Foreign Office on the Berlin Principles. But as I said, the World Charter for Nature and the CBD have the framework for it. The precautionary principles should have made us work on this issue more aggressively. And so there are 5 areas that I think, now that we're in the middle of the pandemic, we have to give priority to. And I'll run through briefly the tools that are available for each of these 5 categories, and you'll see their relevance to getting ahead of the next pandemic. First is biodiversity law. This is quite marvelous. We have the scientific background for it. William Karish was one of the Wildlife Conservation Society leaders who did the Manhattan Principles, and he and others have a book that was out in 2015 that the CBD was a co-publisher of. And we also have the One Health approach from the Manhattan Principles actually finding their way into recommendations that were made to the CBD Conference of the Parties in 2017. Now, the tools we have, the treaties, which all of these One Health initiatives urge us to use, need to be scaled up to work on maintaining the health of wild animals so that the viruses don't need to spill over to the humans. We have the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, which Chris has highlighted the importance of building a stronger campaign against illegal wildlife trade. We have the regional treaties, which do a lot to define sound principles, both in Africa. The ASEAN agreement has to be brought into force, but the Mekong Delta agreement, we have legal capacity amongst governments to cooperate on zoonosis. We have a vast system around the world of protected areas, not just the UNESCO biosphere reserves and geoparks and the World Heritage Areas, but all the national parks that have been put together that are engaged through their park services with the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas. We need to galvanize the protection of protected areas and make them realistic. No more paper parks, effective parks that can manage the health of the animals in those protected regions. We have to, of course, work on combating desertification and restoring the areas from the disruption which is underway. We need to work on the Convention on Migratory Species and not just let viruses migrate on airplanes, but create much more effective range state agreements that can work on habitat health across range states, which will also then probably mean the animals' diseases won't spread out. And then the work IUCN and others have done on transboundary protected areas are critical because of the instability politically in those areas. So IUCN has a lot of policies on this. We actually have a zoonotic section in the report we did on IUCN best practice guidelines for urban protected areas. This is where the interface is immediate between people and wild nature. We need to work much more effectively to expand the regional programs like Natura 2000, the European Protected Areas System, and expand comparable systems in other regions. Now, the United Nations has given us an opening to expand this. On April 2nd, meeting and working through Zoom, like this meeting here, we came up with a General Assembly resolution, which was debated. There was controversy, but it was finally adopted on April 2nd, Resolution 74-270, Global Solidarity to Fight the Coronavirus Disease. It called upon the Secretary General to take leadership in this area. And one of the important decisions favoring One Health was already adopted back in 2017 by the UN Environment Assembly. So the UN Environmental Assembly in its Resolution 4 recognized biodiversity loss as a health risk multiplier and called upon states to prioritize the value of the One Health approach. And I recommend looking up that policy guidance because it will now feed into what the General Assembly itself is taking up. We have tools to work on this. Principle 17 endorsed the role of environmental impact assessment nationally back in 1992, and virtually every nation has now a national environmental impact assessment law. All of those laws have to add to their procedures. How do you do an EIA when you have a potential zoonotic spillover situation? In short, we should prioritize the interfaces that Chris outlined as ways to give priority. If we manage the interface, we don't just have spatial distancing between humans during a pandemic, we spatially distance between the healthy area of nature and where humans might interfere with it. This approach can be put into EIA. It's already, the criteria have been thought through a little bit in the CBD context. We also have a situation in which we need to realign budgets. The advantage of protecting protected areas is that it costs very little. Nature more or less takes care of maintaining its own health if we don't create the interface to interfere with healthy nature. So we've got to begin putting together a more robust budgetary commitment for maintaining animal health in the wild, as well as in domestic situations. And this One Health approach will have to be funded. Money doesn't grow on trees, but there are sources of money even in this kind of a crisis. In the 2009 financial economic crisis, the International Monetary Fund created a large number of special drawing rights for developing countries, so they would have a capacity to address all of this. We're going to have to do that again now. And I think if we can spend several $100,000 on past zoonotic disease epidemics, we can certainly scale up to meet this pandemic in terms of prevention. Nationally, those countries that maintain their own economies can spend their own money by printing it, quantitative easing. But where do we go with this? Well, I think all the policies that we've been putting into place now have to be taken off of the paper on which they're written and put into action. And if you will, environmental law and our policies are like paper parks. We have not been putting the implementation priority to them, which they clearly now are seen to have deserved. So if we're going to reach what is IUCN's overall objective, the role of environmental rule of law that moves us to a just society that values and conserves nature, we're going to have to make a choice. Do we want now to return to business as usual, in which the interfaces will allow a spillover of the next viral epidemic or pandemic? If we want what the UN has been calling for, quote, the future we want, it's time to begin to align our budgets and resources behind protecting the flora and fauna and basically implementing and giving priority to the environmental rule of law. Years ago, and when Earth Day was first started 50 years ago, David Brower, a strong environmentalist, a leader in the Sierra Club and other movements, had basically said the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, not the other way around. Either we maintain environmental health for all life on Earth, or we continue to extract bits and pieces of it until it essentially no longer sustains our human society. And this is the choice the pandemic brings us. Either we're going to have the environmental rule of law as a high priority, or we're going to find ourselves back in the pandemic world sometime in the future. The immediate steps we can take here are to realign budgets, strengthen the courts, the Global Judicial Institute for the Environment that UNEP and IUCN have launched, build up I think it's fair to say it's time to have an international agreement on forests. We tried that in 1992 and before. The incursions into forests have to stop. We perhaps should press for a moratoria on all forest exploitation until we come up with a management system that is effective in protecting human health, and urgently more education, as has been called for. So I thank you very much for bearing with me in this very rapid review of the ways environmental law could be used, and I'm happy to turn the floor over to my friend Elizabeth and Marima, having praised the role of CBD. She will tell us what I've been saying. Thank you.
Let me, if I could, interrupt for a minute and just thank Nick for an excellent presentation. I think any one of your slides could be a 5-hour seminar. And I just wanted to interrupt to let the attendees know that we will share the slides afterwards. There is a lot of rich information in there, and we've had many requests. So as we're going along, the questions are piling up and requests for more information. So thank you, Nick. That was excellent. And now I will turn it over to our dear friend and wonderful colleague, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. I've been asked to speak on reducing biodiversity loss at the crossroads of human ecosystems and animal health. Just to begin with, we are all at the crucial time in the history of humankind for people, nature, and the whole planet. While we stand with solidarity with governments and people everywhere as they fight for COVID-19 and its daunting consequences, especially in saving lives. We know that we've already, statistics latest show 2.5 million people already affected by the disease, and over 200,000 have already lost their lives. Clearly recognizing that with this pandemic, we need immediate global action. It is also clear beyond doubt that COVID-19 is not just a health crisis, it's actually a developmental crisis in the sense that health, economic, social, and environmental disasters need to be tackled and tackled in a coherent and not in isolation. And Chris, both, and Nick underline that aspect. We have learned over the years from pandemics, showing that preventing them and fighting them when they appear require concerted actions supported by long-term visions. And as Nick emphasized, we have not yet learned from that. So this long-term vision calls for fundamental transformation of our relationship with the natural world. And only by doing so, we'll be able to really reduce the risks of witnessing new pandemics emerging in future. So what's the links then between biodiversity and health? Indeed, biodiversity is a foundation of human health. It supports food security, dietary health, livelihoods, and plays an important role in the regulation and control of infectious diseases. Unfortunately, our own human activities have equally played a significant role in driving biodiversity loss. And according to the IPBES, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform, and on biodiversity and ecosystems report, which clearly showed changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation of organisms, anthropogenic climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species are identified as the main drivers of biodiversity loss. IPBES equally also underlined there are equally also secondary drivers of biodiversity, which also need to be brought up into this equation. Human population dynamics, habitat fragmentation, urbanization, industrialization, our own production consumption patterns, governance, trade, and the list goes on, all play a role in environmental degradation, which also lead to extinction of species. All these human activities pose very high risk factors for potential of emergencies, emergence and spread of diseases. These activities, along with climate change, reduce also the abundance of some organisms, causing alteration in the composition of others and modifying the interaction among these organisms, which then alter their interaction with the environment. So patterns of infectious diseases are all sensitive to such disturbances. Chris has given us the figures. Basically 2/3 of human infectious diseases are zoonotic. And over the last 60 years, majority of these zoonotic pathogens have emerged largely as the result of human activities. And the list of viruses was given by Chris. Meanwhile, some factors also increase further spread of vector-borne diseases such malaria and dengue, which are spread by mosquitoes. There is now an emerging body of scientific evidence which suggests that COVID-19, like several other strains of coronavirus, likely or allegedly also have such zoonotic origin. We know the scientific evidence is not yet proven with certainty, but as Chris alluded, we hope soon we'll get there. The continuing loss of biodiversity on a global scale therefore represents a direct threat to our health and well-being. On one side, it increases the risk of emergency and spread of infectious diseases in animals, plants, as well as humans. On the other side, biodiversity loss unfortunately also limits the discovery of potential treatments for many diseases. We know where antibiotics, for instance, are coming from dependent on nature. On the contrary, we also know healthy and functioning ecosystems will equally ensure that nature's control on zoonotic pathogens is restored and will nourish pharmacological research, and thus will allow us the better prevention of and response to pandemic, and therefore better protection of human health. There is undeniable connection between human health and biodiversity, or rather between human health and resilience of nature. COVID-19 pandemic makes it very clear that more robust, comprehensive, coordinated prevention strategies and risk assessments are needed. It is, of course, critical that all countries have the capacity to dictate, assess, and respond to such public health events when they arise in future. International health regulations of the WHO are actually intended to help the international community prevent and respond to such acute public health risks while limiting the interference with international traffic and trade. So how does then environmental law support healthy law? And yet we know environmental law not only support, but also complement healthy law in this battle. We at the Secretariat Convention Biological Diversity, or CBD, have been working closely for many years with the WHO and other partners under our joint program on healthy and biodiversity. And this has actually translated in a number of comprehensive decisions on biodiversity and health. And with partners, we are actually now currently drafting a global plan of action on biodiversity and health. And these tools have been there, are available, but as Nick said, enforcement has not been up to date. More recently, at our last governing body conference of the parties 2018, our parties also adopted Biodiversity Inclusive One Health Guidance, which seeks to assist countries in implementing more integrated, interdisciplinary, and cross-sectorial approaches for the delivery of multiple benefits to human health and well-being. The One Health Guidance does identify epidemics and pandemics as biological hazards that need to be tackled through ecosystems-based solutions. Under the same decision, our parties and governments were actually invited to integrate One Health approach in their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, national healthy plans, but also in other instruments, including those actually developed under the Climate Change Convention, as well as under the International Strategy on Disaster Risk Reduction. This guidance could therefore be an important tool in the prevention against future pandemics, but also in the larger implementation, not just of our Biodiversity Convention, but climate change and 2030 agenda. We are currently working, as I said, developing this plan, and we hope we'll also continue to support for the future. As you may all know, we are currently in the process of developing the next 10-year plan for biodiversity protection, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It is currently being negotiated, and we think it's timely that this framework also plays a significant role in building the resilience we need in the face of growing healthy and developmental challenges. The framework is expected to be adopted at our next conference of the parties, now looking at having it sometime next year. It will serve as an overarching framework on biodiversity, not just for the convention, but all biodiversity convention, the entire UN system, and will be universal to be also implemented by other stakeholders. Through this well-defined, ambitious, measurable target biodiversity post-2020 framework, we hope it could provide now the legal basis to align the biodiversity policies among the parties to the convention, but also beyond and thus to be able to reinforce national actions for conservation of biological diversity and sustainable use of its components, including fair and equitable sharing of the benefits. It will also align policies across range of global commitments, including Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Climate Agreement. In terms of now the role of the Convention, biodiversity, and other instruments, we need stronger enforcement measures to curb illegal trade in wildlife or better control such trade. Will be needed to yield positive results in the prevention of future diseases. While we know improved implementation of policies and rules on veterinary controls of food production and markets will have a direct impact on the potential sources of diseases, and therefore we need to look at that improved implementation. We hear many calls these days of the global ban on live animal markets, and Chris has alluded to that, including wildlife hunting. But and we know that China has actually adopted a new regulation on urgent measures regarding wildlife control, and quite a number of countries, particularly in Asia, are following suit. But agreeing with Chris, we also should not forget that these markets equally have provided, sustain, or continue to sustain the livelihood of millions of people who depend on that for food security, for their nutrition, and particularly the low-income rural areas. So any drastic measures, we need to be careful that they do not backlash and increase the risk for illegal trade of species used as food or medicine. And such illegal trade could actually in turn create new risks for new diseases to spill over and spread to humans. So yes, stricter trade, environmental veterinary controls on the live trade and consumption of wildlife species need to be scaled up globally, as they have potential to significantly reduce the risk for future diseases without putting the livelihood of people who depend on them and consumption into jeopardy. CITES has also been mentioned as an instrument regulating wildlife trade and will be highly relevant to prevent new outbreak due to an illegal wildlife trade. But similarly, we also have the Convention on Migratory Species, and particularly its agreement on the conservation of population of bats. And I will not want to go into detail on that because both Chris and Nick have alluded to that. Let's look at the reinforced implementation of the regulations which have been developed by the World Organization of Animal Health, which we think will be important elements in this equation, since such stricter health and veterinarian controls could adequately help to complement the implementation of WHO international health regulations and other measures adopted by other instruments. Animal Health have indeed developed normative documents relating to the rules that member states can protect themselves from introduction of diseases, including pathogens, without setting up unjustifiable sanitary barriers. They also provide support to developing countries and countries in transition in improving their legal framework and also resources for that purpose. Since the beginning of COVID-19 crisis, given the similarities between COVID-19 and other infectious diseases at human-animal health interface, Animal Health Organization has been working with its Wildlife Working Group and other partners, FAO and WHO, to also develop a long-term work program which aims to better understand the dynamics and risks around the wildlife trade and consumption. We need to get this work moving because of its particular importance, particularly the work between our convention and FAO on agricultural and livestock matters, since that's where food production is, which is the main driver of biodiversity loss, but also potential for pathogen diseases. Getting to an end, where is the global transformation needed and why important? Clearly, environment and health law have played a major role against the battle against COVID-19. But we need a deeper collaboration between states and between different relevant stakeholders, forums, be it international, regional, national, all need to be pursued. We have learned our lesson. Fragmentation weakens both the protection of biodiversity as well as the prevention and response to pandemics. Developments have clearly also demonstrated that reduction in biodiversity loss will be an efficient factor in preventing emergence of diseases. What is needed is really global transformation of our development models and whole of government, whole of society integrated approaches. Nick mentioned of the Security Council decision. I want here to bring the UN Secretary General has also launched a recent report on UN response to COVID-19, shared responsibility, global solidarity, responding to socio-economic impacts of COVID, which was launched last month. Clearly, again, the response has to be shared. It's global response and not isolated. And in this report, the Secretary General notes that countries need to move forward with the implementation of the commitments under 2030 agenda, the Paris Agreement on climate change, especially investing in people, health, and social protection, and seize the opportunity for greener, more inclusive economy and investments. These goals must shape our response and recovery, laying the foundation for resilient people and resilient societies. In conclusion, the adoption of global initiatives such as One Health, which is also part of the Berlin principles, will help to bridge the gap that might still exist between international fora and states, and therefore will support a more holistic approach to the protection of biodiversity and human health. These developments clearly show that many other tools exist out there to prevent future pandemics. These tools are available for the countries, the Secretary General has noted, and it is now for us all and the countries to implement and also implement the commitments already taken by different countries, not to get back into where we are. Reduction in biodiversity loss is therefore at crossroads of human ecosystems and animal health. Decisions to be adopted at our next conference of the parties and other international conferences planned all will play a major role in the global efforts to protect human health and prevent outbreaks of future zoonotics and vector-borne diseases. The fight against COVID-19 is bringing to the forefront the unprecedented sense of collective solidarity and collaboration. We need to harness these positive forces to achieve the shared and interdependent goals of healthy society and healthy planet. Let us work together to take care of nature, and nature should be able then to take care of us. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Elizabeth, and thank you for ending with an inspirational quote. And I just want to mention that Elizabeth had a wonderful article in the Guardian recently, and we will send that to all the attendees. I think all the attendees realize what an extraordinary panel we have. It was very rich and it was very connected, and we have a lot of questions. What we're going to do is first ask the panelists if they have questions or comments on each other's presentation, just maybe 1 minute each. And then we've been trying to organize the questions in a way that everybody will at least have a good answer. We'll follow up with details for those that we aren't able to answer here, but we probably have 10 different areas of questions to cover. But let me actually start with Chris, if you had any comments or questions for the other panelists, and I think we're going to go to gallery view here if we can.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks very much. It was a pleasure, Nick and Elizabeth, to be on this panel with you and listen to and get your insights. I do want to clarify something. I think I wasn't very clear, obviously, in my presentation. So first of all, it's really important to understand it's really not about if the trade in wildlife is legal or illegal, sustainable or unsustainable. It is simply about the fact that it is wildlife, and wildlife harbors viruses and pathogens which we do not are not able to monitor adequately, and we do not know enough about them. There is, so we're asking for a ban on the commercial trade of wildlife for consumption, with a primary focus on mammals and birds and urban centers. So that's really important to clarify, and that really does not impact or directly impact. It should actually support indigenous peoples and local communities, because it's really important to fully realize that there is no longer enough wildlife in the forests to feed these and cover these needs. So we do need to, at the same time, also concentrate on alternatives and providing alternatives. And there are, thankfully, there are alternatives that we can develop. And remember, we need to also really be clear, forget all these romantic ideas we sometimes have. I've been faced with this for months now. The contact and the interconnectedness of this world brings the most remote communities in absolute 12 hours to any European city or to the United States. This has changed the game, so we need to be really reevaluate the situation and rely on good science. This is not about impacting the rights and needs of indigenous peoples and local communities, even though it is interpreted by some on that way. We're really here to help and provide solutions. So thanks for that.
And actually on that point, I do want to mention we have a question from Gretel Aguilar, the Acting Director General of the IUCN. And because it's Gretel, I just want to interject because she asked a question just on that point. So maybe we could stay on that point. And her question is exactly on that issue. The indigenous people's lifestyles and territories are at risk. Communities have poor access to healthcare. Some of the ideas related to wildlife trade can create bigger challenges. So maybe the other panelists can add to Chris's comments about the relationship between indigenous people's rights, health, and environment. And she thanks us for a great seminar. So we're really glad you're listening, Gretel. And Nick, would you like to answer that? And then Elizabeth.
Thank you. I think Gretel raises a very good point, and I think Chris has also emphasized that One Health encompasses all communities. So we have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, the new resolution to clarify how traditional communities can have their, if you will, habitats where they get along with nature perfectly well now and have sustainable food practices, how we have to begin to respect that sector. For a long time, we've had the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that has not been adequately implemented around the world. It is still given service by a great many countries, and there isn't a proactive way to provide the health of indigenous populations. When you have invasions into the forest areas, which is going on now, I regret to say, in the Amazon, we are displacing indigenous communities. And of course, that's going to have the spillover of the viruses, not just to them, but into the communities at large. Manaus right now, in the heart of the Amazon, is in a frightful crisis with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. Those of us in New York know this from firsthand experience. Our heart goes out to everyone there. But we cannot treat One Health as a issue that belongs to only a few people or to one issue or to one place. It is a universal problem. So we have to rally around the One Health paradigm, which is why I think the Berlin Principles give us a very effective way to get out of our silos. if we disregard any part of the community, certainly the indigenous communities who are now full members of IUCN, have to be engaged robustly in coming up with implementing a One Health solution.
Great, thank you, Nick. Elizabeth, can you comment on that?
Your mic is off, Elizabeth.
There we go.
Sorry.
Sorry.
The situation basically reminds us we need to leave the wild animals in the forest, and we need to leave the forest as they're supposed to be. Then the movement to the cities will not be there. The indigenous peoples, local communities have lived with these wild animals. They have developed their own cultural values around them. They have not been affected by these animals. The effect has come by our activities, either cutting the forest and forcing the animals to move, or moving the animals to satisfy the demands and the appetites of the affluential groups in the cities. So we need to go back to the basics. Leave the animals where they're supposed to be. Let's leave the forest the way it's supposed to be. Thank you.
Thank you for that succinct answer. We have so many questions. I'm going to go ahead and dive in, ask the panelists to dive into climate change, climate crisis, global warming. We have a lot of questions about the connection between zoonosis and the climate crisis. And I wondered if, Chris, we might start with you for some reflections on that connectivity and that topic.
Yes, so I've been following the questions a little bit, and that has come up quite a bit. So while it is clear that the origin of the zoonotic disease is a wild animal and a pathogen from a wild animal, the drivers around the emergence and then it becoming a pandemic, of course, are influenced by multiple factors, and most notably, of course, climate change, either directly as in vector diseases where we get range expansion of mosquitoes, or indirectly by just changing the socioeconomic context in which this disease can emerge. And the idea of One Health approach is to actually pull all these socioeconomic, sociocultural, political factors in it, and then over the top, and we're sort of forgetting that at the moment, is climate change, the global discussion. That's a curve we've still got to flatten a lot. So yes, I agree. Those are actually drivers. They're not always simple, and they're often very context specific. That's also important.
Thank you. I imagine that Nick and Elizabeth. So we'll start with Nick.
Well, I think the impacts of climate change, of course, affect everything, just as this pandemic's affecting everything. So we need to factor those in. One of the questions that was directed at me dealt with where does pollution fit into this picture? Well, the gaseous emissions that are part of the greenhouse gas phenomenon are also a source of pollution in many instances. And we have tremendous air pollution now in our major cities, which puts our humans at risk. It compromises our lungs. We have asthma problems growing. And then we are more susceptible to the pandemic because we already have an impaired respiratory system where breathing is bad. The same thing happens with water. I would point out that FAO has been developing a One Health approach to the water pollution that comes from agribusiness, from the agricultural sector. And if you want good guidance on this, go to FAO's One Water program, because the One Water program shows that if we allow viruses to go in with our animal waste into the waters, we're creating vectors for diseases to spread throughout nature and come back to haunt us and plague us as humans. So climate change is going to exacerbate these in several ways, one of which, of course, in the north and part of the south hemisphere is when you don't have a deep freeze anymore, the mosquitoes don't get killed off in the winter, and therefore the mosquitoes can breed more effectively and become more robust disease vectors. They will carry diseases from one animal to us. And managing mosquitoes is going to be a big challenge in the future. We need micromanagement of mosquitoes carefully and other disease vectors. So climate change is going to have pervasive impacts on our natural world. And I think we'll highlight the need for the One Health approach.
Thank you, Nick. And as we go to Elizabeth, I want to put a point on the question here that's from Adamola. And the question is, what's stopping us from dealing with climate change in the same way that we are rising to engage with the COVID-19 crisis? So, you know, can you link those in terms of why aren't we reacting the same way to the climate crisis that we are for this crisis, and how they're connected? Thank you.
Now it's very clear that climate change and biodiversity loss are directly connected and linked. IPBES report has even indicated one of the 5 drivers to biodiversity loss is climate change. But at the same time, we know biodiversity nature also provides part of the solution to climate change, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. The way the forest will absorb the carbon sequestration and therefore then mitigate climate change. So the link is directly, and basically now we cannot talk of biodiversity loss without climate change, or talk of climate change without the other. Why then, probably I will say climate change seemed to have been given focus. Yes, in the past years, probably that link had not been demonstrated, but more and more that direct link is being demonstrated, has been agreed, and I think now it's clear that we cannot deal with one issue in isolation with the other. And when we deal with pandemic, then that becomes even more clear. We know the impacts of climate change on land degradation, on forests, floods, earthquakes, and what have you. And all these then will affect nature of which will affect and further enhance pandemics in future if not taken care. Thank you.
Thank you. And do any of the panelists, before we go to another question, have questions for each other? Something that the attendees might want to know that you might have missed, or a fine point? Any? Okay, great. If not, then the next topic I'm going to go to is I'm going to lump several questions together regarding governance and the environmental rule of law. And of course, those are huge topics. We're getting a lot of questions about instruments of law, instruments of environmental law, what needs to be strengthened, why they're not working. And I know a lot of you have touched on these, but I guess the way I'm going to ask the question is, if there was one particular lever that we could use, that all environmental lawyers could really focus on in the next 6 months to a year to strengthen, where might that one priority be? Where's the greatest opportunity to strengthen an existing regime or framework?
So,
I can begin.
do you want me to jump in, or?
Let's do Elizabeth. Let's go backwards.
Sure.
Thank you.
One branch of law where needs to be focused on, to me, is enforcement. The instruments, the tools, the guidance are there, they have been there. So we need to pick them and really focus on the enforcement. So we need to strengthen and build enforcement mechanisms of the existing tools before we begin developing new ones and forget what is on the table. Thank you.
Is that Nick?
Yes, well, I agree with Elizabeth, but I would also look at if you want a lever that will bring about the political commitment, we need to let the people speak more and support Rio Principle 10, public participation on environmental decision-making, access to information, and access to justice. And the Commission of IUCN on Law has been building up each of these capacities. One of the questions was, how can we explain science to people? Well, if you have public participation robustly, the scientists have a floor. Their voice can be heard, and we can factor that into the decision making. we have to make room for that education, that civic and public education function. The Secretary General of the United Nations issued a report on gaps and ways to strengthen international environmental law at the end of 2018. It was in response to the proposals by France and others to have a global pact on the environment that would unify us all around a set of values and issues, principles to support robust observance of environmental law. But of course, the gaps that report featured didn't even include zoonosis, didn't include the pandemic and the One Health approach, because that wasn't a priority back in 2018 among governments. So we need to make that a priority. And I think when people suffer, as we are now all enduring during this pandemic, the demand for responsive government is going to grow enormously. And this public participation channeled positively into building the kind of new paradigm for development that Elizabeth concluded we need is for me the most important leverage point.
Great, thank you, Nick. Chris, any comments on that?
Yeah, just a sort of a practical, obviously I'm not a lawyer, so, it's funny for me to answer, but I've been involved the last few months, more lawyers than I've ever thought. It's quite interesting. And I've learned a lot. Thank you.
Like that engagement, right, with lawyers?
I love it. It's really interesting because you learn how to move things forward. So one of the things we've seen working with the administrations in China and in Vietnam, both countries, as you know, have made public statements, very, very strong public statements, and are taking measures to ban the commercial use of wildlife for consumption. So working through the legislation that's in place, it's actually really important to first put that legislation in place to help them develop adequate legislation. This is new. No one ever had legislation about eating pangolins. It just doesn't exist. So the legislation is, to put it mildly, inadequate, doesn't address this kind of world we're now living in. So we need to get that in place. And then at the same time, working, as Elizabeth has pointed out, we're working on strengthening intelligence and enforcement to try to catch that shift as there's a slight shift into the illegal trade. And one thing I've seen in the questions I just want to answer, one of the pieces of legislation, or not legislation, but agreements, the CITES treaty is absolutely inadequate to regulate this because it only deals with a very low number of species and does not work on the impact actually that this trade has. It's just on the trade actually in the commercial aspects of it. So that's quite important, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And I do want to mention now, and you just raised it, actually our next webinar, which will be the week of May 18th, we don't have a date yet, will be actually focused specifically on CITES. So you can, all the attendees and the panelists can look forward to that because there's so many areas to cover in future webinars, but that is a specific focus of the next one. Let me shift to a kind of a different topic, which is asked in the questions, which is asked by Songrant. What can practicing environmental lawyers do? What should public interest environmental lawyers do to play a role in addressing and preventing this kind of pandemic? And I think his question also indicates that there are more pandemics coming, unfortunately. So at the individual lawyer level, comments or suggestions for engagement action. Nick, go ahead.
Well, first I think we have to support the health sector. When the first World Health Organization notification came in January, we all should have been worried. It hadn't become a pandemic yet, but a lot of people, frankly, were not supporting WHO in a robust way at that time. And so I think the environmental lawyers locally must be part of the integration of knowledge. That's why I like the environmental impact statement process. If you insist on strong environmental impact assessment procedures and build this into it, then in all decision making, someone's going to have to think about the zoonotic aspects and steps they could take to mitigate adverse effects or promote more holistic thinking. I think local environmental lawyers can ask also their mayors and local councils, do you have an environmental advisory council or a holistic approach? Why is the Parks Department not as important as the Health Department in terms of maintaining a One Health approach? So I think there are many legal tools that can use the One Health approach, but the first thing we have to do, and this webinar helps, is acquaint us with the One Health approach, how to do that. So I'd say study up on the Berlin principles.
Excellent. Elizabeth or Chris? Elizabeth?
Yes. Environmental law is there. And as has already been underlined, the instruments are there, goals are there. They need, yes, to be strengthened. I agree. And I take this opportunity to respond to a question I see addressed to me about the Maputo Convention, which I had the privilege to be part of its revised version. With regards to the regional convention, like Maputo Convention for Africa, the convention itself, it's basically we have the convention, a document, but its implementation is yet to begin. We are still waiting even for the first conference of the parties to set up the institutional mechanism established under the convention to take place. It's now been, it was planned for some time this year, but we know this year everything has changed. So I think we still need to give time for the Maputo Convention to play a role in the Africa continent. But of course, within Africa, there are others. When we look at particularly issues related to illegal trade, there is a Lusaka Agreement on cooperative enforcement operations directed at illegal trade in wild fauna and flora, which even takes a stricter measure than CITES in terms of its objective being total, eliminate and curb illegal trade, which then could be very instrumental for the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Chris, thoughts? Advice to environmental lawyers from a scientist?
No, that would be outrageous. No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have about 5 more minutes to go. I'm going to ask one last question that combines some of the questions that we're getting, and then I'm going to ask each panelist to just give a minute of closing thoughts. And we're getting a lot of questions about national and subnational levels of opportunities of action. What can be done at a domestic level, municipal level? There's questions here about domestic livestock. And so let's bring it down from the international agreement level and focus on our communities, nations, regions. Advice for the attendees about what can be done or should be done at these levels as well. Nick?
Well, I'll jump in. Much of environmental law, as Elizabeth said, has been well established now in national and subnational legal regimes, but I think it's applied largely on the margins. We don't take, for instance, the precautionary principle and try to integrate it holistically into all aspects of behavior. And maybe it's too broad to do that, but pandemics focus the mind, a little bit like executions and final examinations. So we need to get ourselves using the tools that we have in a focused way at the moment of time when everyone is listening to us. After the pandemic is gone, I think we won't return to being ignored as much, but that doesn't mean our priority is considered by everyone to be the priority. There are many people who don't want to work on prevention. and want to work on treatment. So there will be lots of searches for vaccines and the medical side. So the clarity about the One Health approach is going to get, it needs to be magnified. We need to all speak up about it and make the case. That's why I've said that it's time to go back to the proposals IUCN made, the Law Commission made, and members of IUCN supported, to have a new treaty on forests, to go back to the recommendations which were not accepted prior to 1992. But there's a large literature on that, and we treat forests as if they can be nibbled away for the rest of time. Fragmentation is one of the creators of a weak nature and the interface problem that Chris eloquently spoke about. We need to remedy that. Well, you can't remedy that in isolated ways. You have to take some large approaches and maybe a better concept of forest stewardship. The time has come. I think practically every other area of local environmental law that you could, or state and regional environmental law that you could begin to articulate, the environmental lawyers who are listening in on this program will know ways they could apply the One Health in their own areas of expertise. So I would defer to your own judgment. I think the people on this webinar are so experts, and this is the moment for them to take a leadership role locally.
Thank you, Nick. Elizabeth, comments on that?
I don't think I've that many comments or any such, particularly at subnational local level. But now with the state of pandemic we are in, the moment the life comes back, I think the local communities, even before looking at long-term, there will be a task of what probably in the environment we call cleanup. All the medical waste currently being generated, where do they go? Because that's what, these are what will be heavy polluters, particularly at local level. The magnitude which had not been anticipated before, which is being generated now. So I think that they will need to lay some priorities. Yes, looking at the mitigation, risk assessment, prevention for the future, but there will be immediate problem to deal with, which has come up as the result of the pandemic. With regards to the proposal by Nick on the forest treaty, I see in the questions also, there was a proposal of wildlife crime treaty. So if I can raise back to Nikki, which one should we look at, or wildlife will combine forest? Because that proposal, I'm seeing it, this is the third webinar it has come up.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And one of the problems, there are so many gaps in environmental law. We're still not a holistic field of law. We have too many sectors and they don't interrelate. And they certainly don't all examine the interface between animal health or wildlife health and human health. So that is a gap that has to be filled. And that's why the International Council of Environmental Law has been very proactive in supporting the idea for agreement on general principles of environmental law that could fill the gaps. We're not going to get treaties on either subject very soon, but we could agree that things like the precautionary principle are a very high priority. The human right or the natural right to the environment is a high priority. So that if we could agree more comprehensively on the basic principles of environmental law, then we could in fact fill these gaps by intelligent application of those principles. So we need to have the One Health principle, the first principle of the Berlin principles, that if that guides us to fill all these gaps, whether it's forests or wildlife, then intelligent decisions can be made locally or within sectors. So I think it takes 15 years to get a treaty in the normal international negotiation process, and that's fast. So we need to have principles that can be readily applied quickly.
Great. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask Chris to either respond to that or wrap up, give his closing thoughts. And then I'll ask Elizabeth and Nick, and then I'll just have a few things to mention at the end. So we should be done in about 10 minutes. Okay, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I'm just going to wrap up quite simply. I think we've addressed a very broad spectrum. Thanks very much again, everyone, for participating and for your various comments and questions. Unfortunately, we obviously haven't got to all of them. But I just want to, just a few points I just want to make clear. What it's really not about illegal action or crime. It's just about the use of wildlife and the nature of the pathogens that are in wildlife, and we need to address that. And secondly, we need to concentrate on interfaces generally and where those interfaces are increasing. So we need to address not only markets, but also the forests and the forest edges and so on, while securing obviously the rights and needs of indigenous peoples and local communities. I want to point that out. But I really also want to reinforce what Nick was saying about we need to look ahead. Yes, there are immediate concerns. I'm calling in from New York. We're certainly in the midst of the outbreak here, and our frontline medical staff, working 24/7 to save people's lives. So that's obviously the acute response at the moment. Developing therapeutics and vaccines are important, but unfortunately, as you pointed out yourself, there's going to be another pandemic, and the vaccine's just not going to do it. So we need to work on the long-term goals, integrating biodiversity loss, climate change with health. That's sort of the three big pillars. That would be my final work. And I think we're on we're on a good way there. There's going to be a paradigm shift for sure. There's no going back. I hope that's true. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris. I think your perspective as a non-lawyer was really invaluable. We really appreciated it. Elizabeth, would you like to wrap up next?
I'll wrap up by responding to two questions I see. There's a question to me and Nick that we didn't talk anything about aquatic biodiversity, and probably it's not important. It is very important. We know the whole, we have a whole program on marine biodiversity. We know of all the work and the pollution on marine plastics. Plastics in the ocean. We can't emphasize this. And even the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Zero Draft has an aspect of pollution looking specifically at plastics. Another question is whether we need robust non-compliance mechanisms for these international treaties. I fully agree, but also remember, these compliance mechanisms are developed by member states who are the parties to those treaties. So tendency and practice has been more to provide technical support, technical assistance for countries to be able to fulfill their obligations, as opposed to sanction measures, which quote and unquote probably are applied in the CITES, where there could be trade sanctions for non-compliance. But when it comes to biodiversity and the CMO's Convention on Migratory Species, you become too strict. It is the forest which will lose, it's the biodiversity which will lose, will be the species which will lose. So there's this quagmire also which needs to bear in mind. Otherwise, thank you very much. I think key agreed here, there's no one solution which fits all. We need an integrated, overarching approach. We need to work together. Not a single country will have a solution. Otherwise, the current situation will not have been there. So coherent, concerted, integrated approach under that shared responsibility, global accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I just want to say we all wish you the best of luck with your tremendous responsibilities ahead with the CBD, grappling, of course, with all these issues as well. So thank you so much. Nick, final thoughts, and then I'll wrap up.
Well, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to be part of this webinar. I think the goal of a holistic approach in which, as the Brundtland Commission report indicated, back in 1987 in Our Common Future, the Earth is one, but the world is not. It was a wonderful sentence, because all nations are stuck on the planet with the same biological, natural, geochemical cycles and the hydrologic cycle, but we manage our shared Earth in our little sectors, our little geographic areas, or our exploitations in most unsustainable patterns. And we've been grappling to come up with a better approach. Unfortunately, pandemic got to it first. The pandemic, COVID-19, is teaching us what we have tried to do and failed to do. So now all of the frameworks that we've assembled must now be leveraged into full activity. And I think we can do that. I think the biggest test of COVID-19, frankly, is what the General Assembly of the United Nations decided on October 7th. Where is international cooperation today? The United Nations solidarity is absolutely essential if we're going to maintain an Earth in which the nations of the world can do well for their people and their nature. So we have a lot to do, but I think we've got brilliant leaders like Elizabeth who could carry us along. So now we have to do it.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for all you've done. You're always ahead at the cutting edge, and you've been leading our internal discussion at WCL and with other organizations like ISIL on how environmental lawyers can stay ahead. Let me wrap up with three quick points. One is that as attendees leave this webinar, there will be a quick survey, because we really welcome your feedback. This is a tremendous opportunity for us to engage with you, and you're not merely attendees. They're incredible experts, because I've looked at the attendee list and it is amazing. Some of whom we really look forward to meeting you personally at some point in the future. So please take the survey. It really will help us with the next webinars. I also want to mention, and I'm going to ask Emily to put it in the chat box now, that IUCN has issued a statement on COVID. All organizations, all entities, all families at all levels are dealing with it, and IUCN is in the midst of quickly adapting to these changing circumstances as well. So in the chat box, thank you, Emily, there is the IUCN statement on COVID, which you are encouraged to look at. I also want to mention the other commissions, our sister commissions, are doing webinars, cooperating from a various perspectives to engage members and the broader public. So I want to encourage you, if you're not already checked in on that, to pay attention to future webinars from other commissions and from the Secretariat. And last, I think this webinar, and thank you for all the attendees, you've given us great questions and a lot of encouragement. I think this webinar really challenges us as environmental lawyers, because the pace of change, we thought the pace of change with climate change was an incredible challenge, but the pace of change in our field posed by this pandemic is exponential, like the very sad numbers of the pandemic itself. So will we rise to the challenge? I think we must, and we're all helpful, trying to provide encouragement and helpful tools to all of you, whether or not you're in a small town in Asia or a large city like New York, or if you work at the international level like our panelists do, you can all contribute. So stay engaged. I want to thank the panelists for an excellent presentation. Thank the attendees, thank all the people behind the scenes who have been working so hard to put this together. And we hope to see you at the next webinar. We will announce it. And with that, have a wonderful, safe day, and do take care of yourselves. Thank you so much. Aloha.
Thank you.